You are listening to The Art of Sales. Everyone sells every day, and this is your source for conversational, real-world sales and prospecting methods that you are comfortable using and that get results. You'll help people buy instead of pushing them into being sold. Here's your host, Art Subcheck.
There are sales situations that are going on around us all the time, and we can learn lessons from them if we're just looking for them. I'll give you an example here. A friend told me he had just been called for jury duty, but luckily he didn't have to take the time to sit through a trial because he wasn't actually called. And he asked if I had ever served, and I told him that, yeah, I did a few years ago. And, well, I tried to get out of it. I had it deferred once, but unless you're over 65 or a judge or a sheriff or any other type of law enforcement officer and a few other things I'm not, well, we got to do it. Now, I understand it's an obligation and we need jurors and everything else surrounding that. It's just that I do whatever I can within the boundaries to avoid it, since essentially I'm paid directly on what I produce, maybe like you. And if I'm not out there selling, I'm not producing much sitting in a courtroom. So anyway, since I had to be there anyway, I decided to make the most of it, as I do in most situations. And it actually was a great experience. So I'll share what happened and how it relates to sales. First, a little bit of background information. So I was selected to sit on the jury of a criminal case. So what happened? Two guys broke into a house. They terrorized and held a young mother and father and two kids at gunpoint. And they threatened to kill everyone. They asked where the money was. And they got it, which, by the way, was $5,000 hidden in a shoe. There's another story there about why and how they had that, and we didn't have access to that information at the time and couldn't consider it. But as we found out, it was a drug deal that had gone bad. Okay, so anyway, back to the story. Then these guys stole their car after back and forth testimony and closing arguments, and parts of this were actually like TV. Other parts were just boring and sleep-inducing. So then we were sent to the jury room for deliberation. Now, at the beginning of the case, we were told there was no physical evidence, and the prosecution's case was essentially based on the positive visual identification of the defendant by the victims. Now, the other guy, the perpetrator, was not part of this trial. More about him at the end here. So we were told not to form opinions until the end of the entire case. Well, of course, that's impossible in the real world. Even though I tend to philosophically lean heavily on the side of law enforcement, I thought that chances were slim that the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt, just on eyewitness testimony, that this was the guy who did it. But that all changed after all the testimony and closing arguments. The prosecution's case was really pretty strong, and the defendant's was, really shaky. The victims were believable, and they were convincing and confidently pointing out their attacker, in the courtroom. And that was kind of tension-filled. And the only witness the defendant could bring about was his elderly mother from California, who he hadn't seen in years. And she was kind of disoriented and really lacked credibility when she was being cross-examined. Bottom line, I was convinced this dude was guilty. Now, my goal was to be sure we wouldn't be sitting here deliberating for days. So here's where the sales part comes in. During the trial, I made it a point to strike up conversations to get a feel for most of the other jury members during our breaks. And there was a wide variety of backgrounds, careers, demographics. It was a pretty eclectic group. Everyone seemed nice and pretty reasonable, and it was logical. I thought that most people would find the guy guilty too, just like I did in my own mind. And that was just based on the very clear and convincing testimony. So my initial early thought was to suggest that I assume the role of jury foreman, and that's the person who leads the deliberations. However, thinking about this, I felt my skills would be better utilized by helping anyone on the fence reach a decision by taking a more proactive role than a facilitator if it came to that. That and the fact that I found out that another jury member was retired from a corporate position where he worked in labor relations and he often mediated disputes. Perfect, right? So I suggested to the group that since we had an experienced mediator amongst us, that he take that role as jury foreman. And he agreed, as did everybody else. So things are going well so far. All right. So then we took a poll to get an early feel for where everyone stood. Now, going around the table, the first two jurors to speak were a little bit timid, and they probably didn't want to appear to be too harsh, but they did suggest that they leaned towards finding him guilty. Now, I was next, and it was not an accident that I positioned myself a couple people away from being the first. Now, I was not wishy-washy about my opinion. I said I was absolutely convinced the guy did it. And then I proceeded to lay out an argument that was just about as good as the prosecution's, if I do say so myself. The next 7 people, in turn, nodded their head, each saying they agreed. Thinking, great, I don't have to spend all week here. Things were falling into place pretty nicely. Then we were down to the last person, besides the foreman, who I strongly felt was on board with me and everybody else based on our eye communication after each person spoke. So I thought for sure she would cinch the deal and we'd get out of there. Then she said, I hate to be the bad guy, but I'm not completely sure about this. Although it wasn't spoken, the collective thoughts in the room were, what the hell? You gotta be kidding me. I was prepared for this. It was exactly the same as handling a sales objection. I was even prepared for what I say in response to various possible objections. So finally, here we are to the point where I'm going to give you some sales points. Here's what I did in this sales situation to deal with the resistance. Now, of course, the worst thing we can do when faced with an objection is tell the other person that they're wrong, right? We covered that in a previous episode here. And that's what most objection rebuttals do. So to review here, the best route is to ask questions and help someone to, number one, doubt their own belief, and then number two, change their mind on their own. So that was my goal here. The first phase for me was narrowing down what this person, let's call her Kathy, it's not a real name, had a problem with. So I said to her, can we narrow this down to the main concern that you have? And then the next question was, is that the only thing keeping you from deciding? As we were going through this, we were having a conversation. Others were interjecting some of their own reasons, and occasionally we'd get off topic, but I'd always bring it back to the main point and let Kathy, the lone objector, I'd let her talk. And the foreman, by the way, was very good in that whenever Kathy would speak, he'd encourage everyone else to be quiet and also let her talk. And it worked well because she'd say things like, well, if it were me up there, you can bet I'd have lots of people testifying that I couldn't have done it or been there even. Perfect, right? I encouraged her to keep talking. Bottom line, I asked questions designed to get her talking, doubting her beliefs, and then letting her talk herself into a decision. Now, the clincher was when she finally seemed to give enough signals where she was comfortable that the defendant had to be the guy who did it. Now, instead of slamming her with a hard close like, okay, that's your decision, we somewhat just assumed the sale and simply needed to go through each of the 6 counts the guy was accused of and agree on them, which we did. Now, here's the real eye-opener in the experience for me that I use still in all aspects of life, including sales. I underestimated how big of a role emotions play in decisions. They certainly can cause someone to throw apparently, to me, very clear evidence and logic out the window. It was frustrating that even though I was making what I thought were brilliant, logical, fact-based arguments, Kathy continued to resist based on her emotions and what seemed to be really irrelevant comments. Just like sales, right? Once I realized that, I went more to the emotional level, asking her questions about her kids, how she would feel if she were the victim and had those horrible things done to her, and how her family would likely pack the courtroom for her. And that's what sold her. So, bottom line, remember, in sales, we've got to focus on our buyer and what they're thinking. What we want or what we think does not matter. Here's a footnote to the story. We learned after the verdict that the other perpetrator in that home invasion already had been found overwhelmingly guilty and was already in jail. Kathy and the rest of us did make the right decision. Okay, you know what time it is.
Your attitude will be iron every way, you'll never feel what they say. It's the art of the sales quote of the day.
That's right. It's time for the quote of the day, and pretty simple quote today that definitely applies to what I just talked about, and it's from Albert Einstein. And Albert said, "The important thing is never to stop questioning." The important thing is to never stop questioning. All right. Hey, I've got a favor to ask of you. If you're getting value from this show, will you do a favor for 2 other colleagues? Let them know about it. Send them to our show site, theartofsales.com, theartofsales.com. And if you don't yet have my free ebook of 501 telephone sales tips, go pick that up right now at my blog, which is smartcalling.com, smartcalling.com. Thank you so much for investing your precious time with me. I appreciate it. Until next time, go out and make it your best sales day ever. I'm Art Subcheck.